Hi students, welcome to the second part of the Chapter 18 lecture. As I was saying in the previous recording, you can see that there are tropical species as well as Arctic species listed on this chart that shows their thermal neutral zones. And you'll see that these tropical species have evolved in a climate that's fairly constant. There's not a huge change in weather between seasons, and it's fairly predictable. So these organisms have evolved with a fairly narrow range of temperatures in which they can metabolize at their basal metabolic rate. Beyond that, they're going to expend more energy just maintaining homeostasis. Now with the Arctic species, they experience a huge change between the dead of winter and the peak or the height of summer. Arctic foxes, for example, are going to experience pretty high ambient temperatures in the summer, and they will have a completely different looking fur coat, much thinner than their winter coat, in order to deal with these high temperatures. So as long as that Arctic fox molts out of its winter coat and has undergone the physiological changes and acclimatization necessary, they can deal with pretty high environmental temperatures. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, you'll see that they can withstand incredibly cold temperatures, about -28 degrees Celsius. So in the dead of winter, they can still maintain their metabolism even when it is incredibly cold out. Of course, there are many adaptations that they have, including shortened appendages. They have a fairly short tail and fairly small ears that help them to conserve body heat, as well as that ultra-thick winter coat. Eskimo dogs, again, they have a very similar thermoneutral zone as the Arctic fox. They can't withstand quite as cold a temperature without having to expend more than their basal metabolic rate, and they can actually extend their thermal neutral zone a few more degrees than the Arctic fox. Polar bear cubs, a slightly narrower thermal neutral zone, actually a fairly narrow thermal neutral zone if you compare it to the Arctic fox. They cannot withstand such extreme temperatures. Perhaps when they grow older and get more fat accumulated, as well as a thicker coat and less surface area to their volume ratio, then they might extend their thermal neutral zone, but I'm not positive on that. And then the ground squirrel, still a fairly impressive range of temperatures that they can withstand. Okay, some more of the abiotic factors that one has to take into consideration when they're looking at organisms in their particular environments. Water is essential for all life, of course, and there are different challenges for terrestrial versus aquatic organisms. So the main challenge with terrestrial organisms is preventing desiccation, being able to acquire enough water, and with aquatic organisms you have issues with osmoregulation, so solute balance, especially with marine species and freshwater species, as well as anadromous fishes that will actually migrate out of freshwater and into saltwater. Organic nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus are especially important to consider for whether or not plants can inhabit certain areas. And then we have other aquatic as well as terrestrial factors that include the amount of dissolved oxygen, salinity, current and tides, as well as wind and occurrence of storms and fires. Some species are actually well adapted to periodic low-intensity fires. There are some pine trees that actually need fire in order for their cones to open up and be able to reproduce. And then dissolved oxygen is a really important factor when looking at certain fish species. So salmon and trout are only well suited to cold bodies of water because they have a high oxygen requirement. If the water is too warm, it does not hold as much dissolved oxygen. And in fact, due to the recent drought and heat wave in Oregon, there have been a significant number of sockeye salmon found dead along the Columbia River and other rivers in that region due to the fishes essentially suffocating because there's not enough dissolved oxygen in that water that's been warmed by this heat wave that has reached into the range of about 106 degrees on some days. So dissolved oxygen is a huge issue with anadromous fish. The fields of ecology and evolutionary biology are tightly linked, and evolutionary adaptation through natural selection results from the interaction of organisms with their environment. So just as I was saying that you can kind of look at this interaction between the abiotic and biotic component in two ways, you can say that organism is well suited there to live there or it's not. You can also think of it as, well, that organism evolved in this certain set of conditions, so it's going to be able to live in this area or it's not going to be able to live in this area. There's always an interplay between organisms and their environments, and it's kind of like a feedback system. Events that occur in the short term, for example storms or droughts, may translate into effects over the longer scale of evolutionary time. There's a research team composed of a husband and wife, Peter and Rosemary Grant, and they have studied finches in the Galapagos for about 40 years now. One of the things that they've looked at is beak depth and the variability within beak depth in one species. So medium ground finches actually have quite a variable range in beak depth, and what these researchers have found is that the frequency of birds with shallow beaks and the frequency of birds with very deep beaks is very dependent on how successful the plant species that they rely on for seeds have been in recent years. Of course, what is going to influence the reproductive rates of these plants? Well, storms and temperature as well as precipitation are all going to play into that. So in years where droughts make it difficult for plants with very small seeds to reproduce, the plants with the larger, more robust seeds are going to be better at reproducing. And if a bird has a very deep beak, they're going to be able to actually break into those robust seeds, and they're going to have higher reproductive rates as a result of that. Concurrently, those birds that do not have very deep beaks, that cannot gain access to those robust seeds that are more abundant in the environment, due to those plants surviving and reproducing more following a drought relative to the less robust seeded plants, are going to not do very well in those years after a drought. As a result, you're going to see a gradual shift in beak phenotype. So here we have the number of finches on the y-axis and the beak depth in millimeters on the x-axis. You'll see here in 1976 all of these finches on Daphne major kind of fell within this nice little bell curve. So most birds had an intermediate beak depth. However, following a drought event in 1978, you'll see that birds with deeper beaks ended up doing better. They were able to gain access to those robust seeds and thus were able to reproduce. And of course, beak depth is a heritable trait, so they passed that deeper beak depth on to their young. And as a result of these events, we see a shift to the right in the frequency of finches with deep beaks. So it's important that organisms are able to adjust to environmental variability in some way. If an organism cannot acclimate or cannot evolve rapidly enough, they're going to run into some major challenges, and it could potentially lead to local extinction events. And over a long period of time, if the animal can't play catch up with the factors that are limiting it in an evolutionary sense, the whole population or the whole species might go extinct. So there are many different responses that organisms will have to these factors in their environments. There are physiological responses that are temporary, such as rapid adjustments, which include piloerection and constriction of blood vessels near the skin. Piloerection is basically raising the hair or feathers to create an insulative air layer. This helps with adjusting to extreme temperatures. And that's the reason that you'll see birds in winter that look very puffed out. They're trying to basically maintain their body temperature by creating this insulative layer between their skin and the environment at large. And then we have gradual reversible adjustments that occur in response to environmental changes such as acclimation. Anatomical responses are not instantaneous responses. They have been brought about over the course of evolutionary time in response to variable environments. So examples of anatomical responses are short-tailed weasels being able to change their pelage or coat over the course of a season. So here we have one in winter. It has a distinct white winter coat to help it blend in and avoid predation, as well as sneak up on prey animals. And then when summer rolls around, it sheds its winter pelage and acquires this brown and cream-colored coat that again helps it to avoid predation and obtain prey items more easily. Another example of an anatomical response is this tendency for desert-dwelling animals to have larger appendages, such as ears. These help the animal shed heat better. So there's going to be more heat loss due to the blood being near the surface of the skin here. More blood vessels are making contact with the surface of the skin, and that heat is dissipated into the environment. This is a fennec fox. And then here's an Arctic fox. We're seeing a lot shorter ears. It also has shorter legs and it has more body volume in relation to its surface area. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pause here and pick up in the next lecture.